this afternoon and for staying for the entirety of the conference on its first day. Today we are at the 3rd annual Native Liberation Conference that is organized and sponsored by the Red Nation, a liberation indigenous organization that is based here in Albuquerque, but is expanding into other places. And today the title of our panel is Third World Solidarity Economy. And we're going to talk about how to link up different kinds of economic alternatives or alternatives to capitalism and putting some teeth to that phrase and putting some tangibility to these politics. And so we are going to look at efforts in the Navajo Nation, Jackson, Mississippi, and elsewhere, and have a discussion at the end and hopefully get some contributions and some insights from the audience too, so that we can have a productive exchange and an exchange of ideas. Some of the questions that we are looking at and that are orienting this panel discussion are the question of what is a national question in something called solidarity economies, or economies in which people try to work with each other outside of formal capitalist processes, and also within indigenous sovereignty movements or other kinds of sovereignty movements. How do we build these relationships with each other across space and across different kinds of nations and people? We're talking from indigenous peoples to Black people to Hispanic Chicano people. So there's a lot. The previous session was about Irish Native Palestinian solidarities. So there's a lot of connections and bridges that need to be built. And finally, we're asking, is there a third way beyond capitalism and old socialist models of production and exchange, getting out of what C. Wright Mills called the labor metaphysics, about the idea of just working and prioritizing the labor as a basis of revolutionary change, the alienated worker. Can we work at de-alienating people, or for lack of a better way to put it? So that's introduction to the panel, and Yvonne is going to introduce the panelists.
Okay, great. Hey there. I'm Yvonne. I'm a research director at Solidarity Research Center. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I'm joined here by Andrew, who's an assistant professor of geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's also a member of the Red Nation and a board member at SRC, at Solidarity Research Center. And he goes by he and him. And I'm joined by Marley Lister, who's a researcher at Dene Policy Institute, also a member of the Red Nation, and a prolific meme creator. His gender pronouns are he, him, or dude. And on the webinar, on the live stream that we have right now, we're joined by Roberto Flores from the Eastside Cafe. He's an organizer in East Los Angeles. It's a community center, an organization that's creating an autonomous government in East Los Angeles. And they're setting up a community land trust, and he goes by he or him. Unfortunately, we were supposed to also be joined by Kali Akuno from Cooperation Jackson, but he's driving right now in Illinois, and he got into a car accident. He's fine, but he's got like a car full of kids, and I think it's hard for him to join us. So I will be showing a video about Cooperation Jackson, and hopefully maybe we'll have opportunities to have conversations and be in dialogue with him in the future. Great. Hey, Andrew.
Thank you, Yvonne. And Marley will be our first.
Hello, my name is Marley, and I'm just going to get right into it. When it comes to the Navajo Nation, talking about a solidarity economy, what we have to look at least with the Navajo Nation and most indigenous tribe, is the status of land and what that has an effect on any type of development or any economic structures on the Navajo Nation. We did a land reform study where we looked at the current land tenure system. And okay. Anyways, so we looked at the land tenure system that was actually imposed upon the Navajo people in the 20s, and it was a grazing permit. It was imposed under the guise of a conservation conservation policies, and it was the idea of saving the land, saving the people. The Navajo Nation is actually one of the biggest land base within it's one of the biggest tribal land bases within the US. And we were actually able to maintain a lot of our land. And so when it comes to the management and control over it, regulations were imposed in the 20s under the guidelines of conservation policies. And it was also initiated by the livestock reduction. And this also signaled a turn away from a subsistence economy or a traditional Navajo economy, which relied on sheep, farming, hunting, as well as sharing produce and whatnot. So that is what initiated, that was the largest turn in event when it came to the Navajo Nation economy, but it also structured and set forth the land issue that we have currently, which is lack of accessibility to land in the hands of a few people. And it's not like this capitalistic few people who manage to get all the land in their hands based on accumulating profits or anything like that. It's actually more grazing permit systems that were passed down, and it was meant to accommodate the traditional Navajo way of life. But it's a very weak understanding of it's a very simplistic way of looking at a complex system of land control and land management, and also how it's passed down to throughout the generations. And so the current issue that we've noticed is that the best way to describe it with the land tenure system is that the Navajo Nation has been fractionalized. Okay, I'm sorry. Anyways, and so in this case, we look at how land has kind of changed. The relationship with land that Navajo people had was very collective based on use rights. You couldn't sell or own anything. It was more, if I wanted to, use Andrew's land, I'd have to ask him. If he wasn't using it, he'd be like, sure, go for it. But he could never say, my land costs a certain amount of money, there you go. And so now what we have is like this weird fractionalization of land ownership where based on how the grazing permits are set up, they develop this idea that this is my land and I have full control over it. But that's not just based on their perception, but it's also kind of backed up by institutions of grazing permits. So this causes issues for development. And if you go to the Navajo Nation, you can throw a stone in any direction, and there's a good chance that you'll see someone who's like wanting jobs, wants some type of business or to build a better economy. Actually, in some cases, people don't even think we have an economy. That's just kind of how scarce it can be seen. And so in this case, we look at, the findings showed that this fractionalization of land has caused a lot of issues for Navajo people. When you want to have any business development, you have to get the permission of that grazing permit. So say this whole area is the Navajo Nation and you want to put a subway right here. And this is my grazing permit land, I can easily deny it and, say no to that. Not that, Subway is going to save the Navajo Nation or anything, but it does provide some type of job. It provides some outlet for that. So that's the current issue with the Navajo Nation. And then from this, we have to think of, okay, we recognize the issues. How are we going to deal with it? And I think the best way to do this is to structure a new land tenure system that fits the values of the Navajo people. And it would not be in the form of individualizing or having these ideas of this is my property. It's actually more of taking it back in control of the tribe. And again, that also means eliminating the status of trust land, which has always hindered any type of development within Indian country. If you don't know what trust land means, it means that the federal government holds land within trust and they decide. It's very colonial as well as very paternalistic. The idea was that natives don't know what to do with their own land despite living here since forever. So that's one of the alternatives. We would argue that our chapter officials, as well as people who are organizing, who want to see change within, have to fight this already long-term policy of trust land. Like the land has to be returned to tribal control. And then that looks into, okay, how are we going to, who controls it within the government? Is it going to be local government, centralized government? I think for the most part, due to the current political structures of the Navajo Nation and the social structures that existed prior to that, it would seem more of very local level planning. People would know, they would need community developments. They would follow in step of what they want to vote for. So, I would imagine it'd be like central government. They would be playing the role of just making sure planning is going right. But these local governments would be the ones who have the power to say, hey, we want this here. this is what we would like. We would like infrastructure. I actually just got out of a panel where I was moderating and was talking about infrastructure and how settler colonial projects use infrastructure as a tool of controlling as well as yeah, I guess mainly regulating migration. And this is to the often people in southern Arizona. And that could cause some issues within our community, like, oh, well, they're just going to use infrastructure to control us. But it would be much more readily accepted if it was them, the people in their community, planning this out. And that's pretty, I think for us, that's not really that radical because we already see residues of this. We already see, Navajo people kind of working within our chapter house system, making these plans. And it does bring up questions of local government and how those will interact with central government. But looking at land and looking at the policies and the relationship that we have with the land are the first step. And then from there, we can develop a political structure that would, in essence, liberate us. And it'd be an ongoing process of dismantling the settler project, settler colonialism, and the way that I believe it connects to other issues is that this is just the particular situation of indigenous people. There are obviously other people who live in the US and they have their own ways of emancipating, they have their own alternatives. And those are going to be the people that follow me, but also I think that the beauty of it too is that they will offer insight into how Navajo people can organize themselves, so we don't replicate capitalistic relations. We don't exploit our own people. Like the Marxist theory of surplus value and exploitation. We don't replicate that. We have a more informed Navajo economic system that doesn't lead to exploitation. That might actually be based on relationality rather than profit, or like maybe even changing the idea of what it means to be revolutionary. Yeah, that's all I have to say. And
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Roberto, are you there? Yeah, Roberto's there.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, just hold on a second. Okay, here we go. Okay, go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah, so to begin with, to be truthful, we hadn't thought about solidarity economy per se in the terms some of you are talking about, but just in the actions, I think we move in that direction. I'm from the Eastside Cafe. The Eastside Cafe is a community space. We call it an autonomous community space because we hardly relate. We mostly ignore the official quote unquote government, and we operate independent of them. And as I speak right now, we are having what we call a women's market at the Eastside Cafe, which comprises of maybe 50 different collectives selling their arts and much like powwows. However, we also are selling things that are made in Michoacan, particularly this area of Michoacan called Cheran, which is a community that has armed itself against narcos and the government and the police, and been able to keep them out. We're selling things for them, and so that's more of a solidarity exchange there. And we're also selling things for folks over in Guerrero, the community Policía Comunitaria, which is the indigenous people rights under the Mexican Constitution to set up their own police force, local police force in their own land. And so we sell things for them as well. We want to explore, I'm very interested in everything you are all saying, and we want to definitely explore. We are not, we are, as I said, we just, as I speak, we have a women's market. It could be said to be a capitalistic venture, but it's not a corporate capitalism. It's not a neo global corporate capitalism. It's a local exchange and a local market. And so, in a sense, we attempt to stay away from the state, and we are, of course, very anti-corporate capitalism and do not want to replicate uh, their ways, their structures, their relationships. But we do want to set up and learn and understand from our own ancestral ways, um, ways to exchange and sell things in a way that isn't exploitive or corporate capitalistic. So we look more at the state structure onto which corporate capitalism attaches itself as the main hierarchical structure um, that we want to flatten out, or if we can't, we set up something very different than the state. So more of a network society, and have the types of economic relationships with other communities. Many of these women are from Boyle Heights, some are from Lincoln Heights, some are from East LA, some of them are from Highland Park. And for those of you that know the LA area, you can understand that these are different communities that are also taking steps in trying to develop local autonomy and local economic structures. We're at the very beginning of this, and we're learning a lot, and I'm very interested to hear more of what you're all saying.
Roberto, could you speak more about Eastside Cafe, like, how you're founded based on Zapatista principles, the different activities and collectives that are within Eastside Cafe?
Okay, so the Eastside Cafe is based on where it's inspired by the Zapatista uprising and the Zapatista development of their own economy and their own cultural and practices. But it's also, in the main, I would say, inspired by our own struggle, our own history of struggle against the system, our attempts towards socialism, state socialism, or state communism, our attempts towards reformism. All these struggles have been very important in terms of informing us, how to do, how to proceed. And so we set up the Eastside Cafe maybe about 15 years ago, and just with the with the goal in mind of setting of us in facilitating what we feel a community naturally wants to do, and that's to be autonomous and to decide for itself its own destiny, self-determination. But the community needed to know itself to be able to do this. So we set up a space, a cultural space, where the community can come in and out and get to know each other. And so we have classes on music, particularly jarocho music from the state of Veracruz. We have all the other things that people have been asking for, like even Zumba, yoga, women's circles, men's circles, excuse me, different types of classes, like English classes. and just different needs. There's a youth group, there's an open mic, there's different things for different sectors of the community. So as a community begins to know each other, it can begin to struggle together and dream together and understand its own power. And so we're not poised towards taking power. Excuse me, I've been sick for a while. But we're definitely want to actualize the power we already have as human beings and as community. But we don't want to play, we don't want a part in this capitalist system. We don't care for it. And we want to step aside and let it fall and help it fall. We also want to set something up. So we're not just resisting and on the defensive. That's completely exhausting. But we are trying to create a new type of relationship and a new type of way of organizing society. Any other question? I'm so sorry. Been sick.
No worries. I hope you feel better. Thank you, Roberto. We're gonna switch now to. I'm sure folks are definitely gonna have questions for you.
Okay, sure.
We have like a 15-minute scheduled at the end for Q&A. I think for now, I wanted to share a video about Cooperation Jackson, especially since Kali wasn't able to join us.
Okay.
So just,
Maybe I can just say one last thing.
oh, sure.
We do want to take this effort all the way to setting up a parallel government or a coexisting parallel government. So that's about it.
Cool. Thank you. Okay.
Sure.
All right. I think I'm sharing the video, so I'm going to play it right now.
Together, we're building a new economy in Jackson based on cooperation, solidarity, workplace democracy, dignity, workers' rights, human rights, sustainability, and self-determination.
Cooperatives are important because it's a business model which provides ownership to the people who shop, who support, who work the particular industry that you're looking to enterprise in. And so I think that that's an important model for sustainability. That's an important model for economic development and growth. And, the majority of the citizens of Jackson own very little of the actual businesses which function here in Jackson. So it's important that we provide this model to the citizens so that they can have something which is invested back in them.
And if we continue, like I said, to strive towards coming together, and it's not hard to do, we can do it. We've done it before, and all we got to do is go back and do what we did in the past. Because I grew up in an area where families, we all stuck together. If you didn't have sugar, I had sugar. If you didn't have, if your children didn't eat, you can come over to the house and eat. So we're going to have to get back to those things that we once did. We can overcome our deficit of poverty, hunger, financial situation, everything. Homelessness, we will not go on if we support cooperative economics of Jackson.
We are Cooperation Jackson!
So I just want to say really quickly, unfortunately, because Kali isn't here, how many folks are familiar with Cooperation Jackson? Cool, and what's going on there? And there's a great book about the experiment in radical economic and political democracy that's happening there, Jackson Rising. There's sections out here that you can also just access online, and including the Jackson Kush Plan, which is a plan that Kali Akuno wrote. So basically, just quickly, Jackson is the capital of Mississippi. It's also the capital of the Black Nation that Cooperation Jackson is trying to start. It's a movement that started in the 1960s or 70s. I think there was a meeting in Detroit, And it was decided that Black folks wanted to reclaim the 5 states in the Black Belt that have historically been mostly Black, and create like a new Africa starting from there. And they decided strategically that Jackson was the place to start, just based on its importance in terms of the political economy of the region. So people started moving to Jackson from all different places, like from New York, from Los Angeles, from Detroit. There was even an exciting shootout in the 80s with the police. And then I think about 2 years ago, Chokwe Lumumba was elected to the city council and then elected as a mayor. I think in his first term, he managed to pass an increase in sales tax, but then passed away, unfortunately. And his son, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, is now been elected as mayor as of like a few months ago. So basically, the Jackson Kush plan is based on 3 legs. It's this idea that they talked about in the video of cooperative economics, that there be, an economic based on worker cooperatives, producer, exchange cooperatives like eco villages, something that is, more collectivist and equitable. Secondly, that there be participatory democracy, so that there be popular assemblies that are organized. I'm going to pass this book around while I'm talking. That there be like popular assemblies where decisions get made by people that then get floated up into the city, so that there also be electoral power be taken. Now, I know that there's been a lot of conversation about how there's a difference of opinion now. There's a kind of a splinter appearing within the movement, and there's a difference of opinion between folks who, the Lumumba administration, who has taken control over the mayor's office, and then the rest of the movement. And so I think, that's something that, has arisen. But that's what I wanted to share. I'm so sorry that Kali isn't able to join us for this. Sure, yeah, I can talk briefly about Asian American Solidarity Economy. So I've been convening a cohort of Asian American organizations around the country who are incubating worker cooperatives. So that included 2 organizations in New York City, SAPNA NYC and Wishwas. SAPNA was incubating a childcare cooperative, and Wishwas a garment cooperative, mostly of Bangla women, one in the Bronx and one in Queens. Another youth-led organization, Viet Lead, in New Jersey and Philadelphia, that was organizing a coffee shop and a green nail salon among their youth members and doing a lot of political education around cooperative economics. A group in New Orleans, Veggie Farmers Co-op, that was mostly made up of Vietnamese elders that were trying to rebuild New Orleans after Katrina and create livelihoods for the Vietnamese community, and create organic foods and kind of like food industries coming out of there. And then finally, the Filipino Worker Center in Los Angeles that had created a worker center of home care workers. Anyway, so we kind of convened a cohort and provided technical assistance for folks, but that really got us interested in what is the history of cooperative economics in Asian American communities. And we were really inspired. I say we because it's my colleague Parag Kandar and myself that engaged on this project together. We were really inspired by a great book by a mentor of ours, Jessica Gordon Nebhart. The book is called Collective Courage. It's a history of the Black cooperative tradition, which shows that starting from freed runaway slave communities that shared resources cooperatively to land cooperatives in the South to during the civil rights movement, like they referenced Fannie Lou Hamer, who started a pig farm that raised like 2,000 pigs for tons of families. There's a strong tradition, and W.E. Du Bois talks about like the importance of cooperative economics to lift up Black communities as well. There's a strong tradition of so we were curious, well, what does that mean for Asian Americans? So we've been kind of conducting that, and I've been doing more of a historical survey into that history. And there is definitely that history and still contemporary practice of these in our communities, in immigrant and refugee communities, like lending circles, like family associations, like mutual aid networks. And it's just really important to lift this up because I think, like Roberto said, these are not examples clearly of corporate capitalism. I would say they are examples of a prefigurative new type of an economy. Not everything is capitalism. We actually live in really diverse economies right now, as feminist geographers J.K. Gibson Graham talk about. And to think of it this way, to frame it this way, and not as the informal economy or as the shadow economy, is to actually reclaim this as a space of hope and possibility. To think that there are alternatives that currently exist and that we can expand upon them to broaden them. And I just wanted to clarify before we go into kind of closing remarks we're early.
Yeah, we're doing good.
Oh, wow. We're unlike the rest of the conference. I just wanted to say really quickly, we've been using this word solidarity economy and it's part of the workshop title. What does it mean? So it's a framework that has been created by a series of social movement encounters called the World Social Forum and the US Social Forum. So starting in the early 2000s, a group of civil society folks, grassroots organizers and NGO folks came together and, created our own alternative venue to talk about what are the social issues that we as a social movement want to work on. I think the first one happened in Porto Alegre, Brazil, and at least in US, it was in 2006 in Atlanta. And there was a whole track around solidarity economy, which was really a desire, like Roberto said, to not just resist, but to build something. So to build, to resist neoliberalism, to resist capitalism, to resist settler colonialism, but to build upon these alternatives that already exist among us. There's a couple of key things that at least the US Solidarity Economy Network has defined as part of that framework. Firstly, being that solidarity economy is a transformation of capitalism. It's not just a reform or to make capitalism a little bit nicer to certain groups of people or to all people even. It's a real transformation of capitalism. And that also it respects people and it respects the rights of Mother Earth. And that be an important aspect of the way that relationships are organized under this system. And there's 5 principles. There's solidarity, equity in all dimensions. So that's, racial equity, gender equity, in all dimensions, sustainability, participatory democracy, and lastly, pluralism, so that it will look different in different places. So a solidarity economy in Los Angeles, which is what we're trying to map out right now, is going to necessarily look different than in the Navajo Nation, because of the historical particularities, the demographic characteristics and everything. So pluralism, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Cool, so we're gonna have more time for Q&A.
It's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
All right, I want to first, before I begin the closing remarks, I do my native male, man with a mic syndrome. Thank Yvonne for organizing this session. She did a lot of work in bringing us together and came all the way out from California to be with us today. So before we begin the closing remarks, I just want to thank you again, Yvonne, for doing this. And so how many of you have read Vijay Prasad's book, The Darker Nations of People's History of the Third World? And so this is how I think we are thinking about the Third World as not something that's underdeveloped or a place of poverty, but a place of alternatives and a place where we don't have to fit within the first world at that time, which was a capitalist world, or the second world, which was state socialism. And what we're looking for is a way in which we can emancipate ourselves as colonized people, liberating ourselves and also liberating our former economies and bringing them back into practice. And so this is something that is part of the orienting premise of this panel. And so when we're thinking about this in Indian country, we're thinking about this for Native nations in the United States, we have to think about how do we extract ourselves from capitalist processes. And this is something that's really difficult because we've been incorporated really thoroughly and over generations into large extractive projects like coal and oil and natural gas and other kinds of things. And this is what I work on as a researcher. And we have to think about issues of dependency and underdevelopment. This is a literature that I think is undervalued. Actually, it's something that was out of vogue with a post-structuralist turn in academic work, but it actually does explain a lot of how our economies work and how our politics orient around economies, meaning like, for example, Navajo Nation continuing to endorse coal and endorse coal projects and other kinds of extractive industries. There's a lot more to say about that, but so when we're talking about moving towards alternatives and moving towards indigenous socialism, indigenous communalisms, indigenous solidarity economies, how do we do that? That's the task, right? And that's what a panel like this and a place like this is meant to discuss. And and I'm just going to offer a few thoughts on that. I think one of the main challenges we have, and getting back to the orienting questions of this panel, is the national question. When we think about ourselves as nations independent of each other and distinct from each other and sometimes in competition with each other, this is a divisiveness that hinders us from moving beyond colonialism. So we have the Hopi Nation, we have the Navajo Nation, we have 17 or 18 pueblos in New Mexico, 22 tribes in total in Arizona. And we think about ourselves as individual, almost like nation states. You know, it's a curse of the nation state, as a famous African historian, Basil Davidson, said about decolonization in Africa. We have the same problem here in the Americas. And so what we need to think about is how to integrate our economies, how to think about ourselves as one identity, as a solidarity, not just in terms of rhetoric or in terms of declarations, but actual agreements. What would a free trade network look like between tribes and putting tariffs on imports from the United States? How would that might work? What if we had independent currencies? Like, we could even use the tools of nation states against colonialism. And so this is something that we need to start working on. And I think the work of the Net Policy Institute is good at that. I'm inspired by people like Janine, who's sitting here in the front row, and her way of rethinking about the environment, challenging the ontologies of the state as being divided by boundaries between like Arizona and New Mexico, but thinking about things in terms of the natural boundaries and how we create governance around that, about the food solidarity networks that's happening in indigenous communities that was part of Dana Eldridge's project in the past. There's a lot of alternatives that are being articulated. We're not absent of ideas. It's just a way of putting them into conversation. And that's something that the Red Nation has been really successful at doing, bringing diverse voices together in order to try to move us forward and to create a politics around that. So this is something to think about as we move forward. And the question that I want to leave, that we agreed, I should say, what we agreed to leave the audience with, and that we'll begin our discussion, is how do we build solidarity economy network to support each other? So how do we do this? So that's where we are opening it up to the floor. Yeah.
I think we're taking questions on Twitter. So for folks that are watching by live stream, you can use the hashtag #ThirdWorld to send us a question. I did see that there was a question from Leeds Cat. It's a question for Roberto. Have folks at Eastside had thoughts about using alternatives to fiat currency? I don't know, Roberto, if you want to answer that.
Well, you know, I'm getting ideas. Can you want me to speak on this?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe 20 years ago, we began to think in terms of community currencies, and we were thinking of El Sereno in particular developing what we call the El Sereno baby. And of course, you know, baby is the furthest thing from capitalism, right? The word baby. And so we were going to set up a bank and distribute, you know, produce the money, then distribute it, and then have people exchange it for different things, like an elderly woman can ask a kid on a bike to go buy groceries and give in exchange for a few babies, and then the kid could buy bicycle parts for his bike. A roofer can help his neighbor, and he can, for exchange of babies, and we can accomplish a whole lot of things by set up a different economy just by exchanging babies. And it wouldn't have to involve permission from anyone. Wouldn't have to involve some kind of legal status. It would just be the community exchanging favors in reality. And so at the end of every year, we would come in or maybe, 5 years, or at the end of every year, we would hold a big ceremony and burn all the babies, burn all the dollars or whatever, and have a bonfire and come to the realization that all we were doing was exchanging help, exchanging solidarity. And that's what we had in mind. As you are all speaking, I'm thinking, why can't we do this on a regional level? Where, between Boyle Heights, all the East Side, can participate. Maybe we can get the South Central side to do the same and exchange with the same. It would be like the same currency.
So maybe we should take questions from the audience.
I just want to say the person that tweeted this question wanted to share that to all the panelists. And I know this is something you've talked about, Andrew, about creating an alternative currency.
Oh, okay. So the question about alternative currencies would be very useful. I got this. I stole this idea from our friend and mentor Morona Benali, and when I worked at DPI 10 years ago. But it's an interesting idea because it helps. I mean, there's other places that have done this. I used to live in Ithaca, New York, and they had an alternative currency where you can buy different kinds of services from people if they participated in these in this program. And it's not something that is impossible or beyond the legality of the United States. As we know, the United States tries to penalize anything that challenges capitalist processes, and so if you don't pay your debt, they'll have a law about that. If you forego some sort of fine, then they'll add interest and things like that. And so there's a legal structure to enforce these kinds of things. But for alternative currencies, there's nothing that prohibits you from doing that, and we just haven't done that in native country. In fact, I went to an economic development conference a couple of years ago at ASU, and I put this to some of the economists who were speaking about it. They're like, yeah, maybe this would actually help to develop the indigenous economies, like the Navajo Nation, for example, because the statistic that we work with is that 70 cents of every dollar earned in the Navajo Nation immediately goes outside to border towns. And so they're really capitalizing on their proximity and on their colonial relationships with tribes. And they have direct economic benefit from that. And if we were able to stop that in any way, that would really do a lot for us internally within our own community. So,
yeah. So again, like I said, we both worked with Moroni, and that question prompted me to think of an alternative sort of currency on the Navajo Nation. And I think Andrew pretty much hit the point as to what the possibilities are for tribal officials if they choose to go that way, rather than, maintaining the status quo or listening to outside economics or economists, they could, kind of push the envelope and try something new. And at least that's what I would expect for tribal officials, for them to go beyond what has always been done and to assert maybe tribal sovereignty in a way that actually will benefit us. I mean, we have a very large economic leakage on the Navajo Nation. And, I've mentioned previously that we did have traditional economies that were more orientated towards solidarity economies. We weren't really introduced to poverty until we started getting involved. Yeah, I'll pass to you.
Just, I forgot to mention, there's I don't want to sound like a neoliberal. That's a bad thing to say, but I don't want to sound like a neoliberal, but the other thing you can do with alternative economies is you can quote its value. So if the value of the Nate Basin is less than that of the dollar, then it provides incentive for industries to relocate in Indian country within our tribal government. So that is a neoliberal prescription, but there is that possibility. I'm sure Robert Miller from ASU would appreciate that. So should we take?
Yeah. And there's another question on Twitter, but maybe do folks here have questions? We can take like 3 questions at a time. I'm gonna show.
Janine has a question.
Roberto.
And then you, and then yeah. Oh yeah, I'm doing this. Huh? Janine, you, and then somebody else. There's a drawing at the end for the question. People ask questions. Okay, Janine.
Do you guys want to get up and talk into the mic?
Yeah, go for it.
Just building off of this question about alternative currency. This is something that we explore in our work as like the long-term vision of building alternative economies and reimagining our relationship to the dollar, but also how that reflects on how we value human labor, like investment in people, and our relationship to our raw materials, our resources. This is obviously an ongoing conversation. This is something that has been like explored in different ways across the globe. And right now, Bitcoin is like, and blockchain are like two of those big ways that they're looking at helping indigenous nations and other peoples sort of explore the different, like building alternative economies on the virtual level. And I know that the Aloha coin is one of those examples of how indigenous peoples are trying to use that technology and use the emergence of this to their advantage to do exactly this. And so I was wondering if that, if you guys thought about
I
that.
think that's a good comment. Yeah, because I don't know anything about it. Let's take this question now, and then we'll take that. We'll do 3 at a time. Is that good? Judith Basil?
Okay, so you touched on grazing permits earlier.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering how you think communities that are reliant on traditional ways like Black Mesa, where grazing boundaries are reinstated without proper consultation, and they're now facing livestock impoundment, how can we overcome those regulations to continue their livelihood?
Let's take one more question. And then I want to read the question from Twitter.
Kind of on a similar topic, in my opinion, I think that self-determination is really tied also with self-reliance and building like long-term eco-centric food systems, localized food systems. How much is that being looked at on indigenous, excuse my ignorance in this area, that's why I'm here. How much is that being looked at and developed on indigenous land, and what kind of blockages as far as legislation are there to prevent sort of localized food systems from being developed?
Great. Thank you. And you want to take one more question on Twitter?
Actually, maybe you guys can answer it first.
I think you should answer the livestock one. And can you answer the food topic too, since that's your research? Yeah.
Okay. So, and the question regarding Black Mesa, the reason why I think it's good to look at how the grazing permit system got caught up in that. The historical aspect was that it was mineral extraction kind of pitting two tribes against each other, and then grazing permits kind of existing as it is became a tool of oppression to take away from indigenous people in that area. And so when I think of it that way, it goes back to an economy. I'm from the area north of that, and we have our own consequences of living near that, which is the Bennett Freeze. Development was halted for us. But my understanding is that prior to any federal intervention or any talks of mineral extraction, Navajo people and Hopi people live in harmony. They just respected each other's boundaries, and they even had ceremonies together as well. It wasn't until that intervention came into being. So that for me, the Navajo Nation, it wasn't really a question of grazing permits. I wouldn't look at through a framework of how can they overcome this, but rather how can the tribes work together to form a solidarity amongst that. And there is a lot of tension between that, but I think there's also a lot of Navajo and Hopi people my age kind of coming together and kind of looking at what actually caused that and being more critical than just saying, oh, that tribe wants our land, that tribe, wants mineral rights. It's more of looking at how can these two communities work together and return to that stage of, harmony, but also in a bigger question or a bigger picture would be, how can the Navajo people work with the Hopi people in establishing trade systems, intertribal trade systems. Again, Marona has brought this to our attention as well, that these existed prior to colonization. We've had very complex and extensive trade systems prior to all of this. And then once the settler colonial project started, it kind of divided us. So then that's something we would have to think about too, rather than looking as nations. And I think that's the best way to describe the quote that Andrew mentioned, was that I think the tribe is looking out for itself individually, rather than, hey, that's the Hopi tribe, we should work together with them as we've done before. and we should come to some kind of, I want to say agreement, but some kind of, I guess maybe agreement as to how we can overcome that. And that would be moving away from mineral extraction. It would require kind of becoming harmonious with the land. I hope that answers your question.
If you haven't read it, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's first chapter in her book, Indigenous Peoples History, really talks about the historical trade networks that existed before U.S. colonialism. If you don't mind answering the food sovereignty question, do you mind introducing yourself? Yeah. Sorry, I can't pull the mic. Yeah, I'll try to work on that wire.
Hello, so my name is Angelique Montigos. So I'm a PhD student doing my PhD on the food movement on the Navajo Nation. So concerning like a question about self-determination and how it is linked to food system and food sovereignty, that's very accurate. So from what I've studied, from what I've learned from the different people I've asked, so there's a lot of initiative going on the Navajo Nation. And so there's an interesting difference between different concepts like food sovereignty, food rights, and food sovereignty. So the first, well, there's a lot of issues, but food sovereignty is also linked to land and water right and state. So there's a huge problem on all the indigenous nation in the USA and in America, because they don't control their land, they don't control the water, and they don't control, so it first comes with taking back access to this. Then the other major problem is the government, the federal government, USDA, in implementing any change. And the tribal government also seems to be complex. We have, like the NAPI, and for example, NAPI is Navajo based, but their seeds come from Monsanto. So when you talk about food sovereignty, that's kind of a huge issue. Like, how are we sovereign? Doesn't matter. So there's also the issue of seed repatriation. Who owns the seeds? Who owns native seeds? Why should indigenous people buy the seeds? So it's also like rebuilding all these trades between different tribes, the different way, of recovering the seeds and taking back control of the seed. So that's kind of a quick answer to this.
There's 2 more questions on Twitter, but do folks here have?
And just one quick response, there's an interview that Marley did with her on Wish Day podcast, and we'll put a link up somewhere. So it's really extensive. A couple more questions. We got this gentleman in the back, and then I think this, did you have a question up here too, or no? Okay, you did. Okay, yes, sir.
Right, just come up.
Yeah, or you can just shout it if you want.
I can shout it. Just more of a comment, because there is so much talk going on food sovereignty and also justice. Is the case of Alaska. I don't know if you folks are looking at Alaska. I work primarily with indigenous sisters up there. I won't use the word trade. There they use the word sharing. It's very extensive. So I get salmon and you get caribou, and we share back and forth. Why? That goes on. That's very a lot. And also, as you know, extractivism in Alaska, both the federal government and the state is coming down. Taxes, the word taxes came in. That's where the state and the federal is imposing various things, and lots of big fights. Famous cases, Kitty John is one famous one. So that trade, sort of the idea of the trade of the informal sharing goes on. But one thing I hear repeatedly, and folks may know this is not my area of scholarship, is what they say is even when you exchange, let's say you give me caribou, and I go fix your machine, both are taxes. Is that really true or not? So when, yeah, so I mean, that's how they perceive it, is that the state would come after you if this is all public. So it's kind of almost in an underground, so they use the word sharing. Okay. Because otherwise, you give me caribou and I fix your snow machine.
Yeah.
There is an economy that's forming, and then the state will come after you. So if anybody knows more on that, I'd love to hear that.
So the question was whether or not in informal exchanges, the United States and the state
Will come
governments will tax you for it. I don't know. I'm not a tax. Actually, I owe so much in taxes. I pay a lot in taxes. I always get pissed off at these "don't tread on me" people. I'm like, I'm paying all your taxes. Stop complaining. Anyway, so yeah, sorry, don't know.
I don't know, Roberto. Roberto, do you have anything to add about that? Do you know anything about
Last question, I could not hear at all.
Oh, he couldn't hear it at all. It was just like whether the bartering economy, the gift economy, whether it's taxable.
That is the correct term, barter economy.
Right.
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't think I'm hoping it isn't. I think we would have to decide that. I think it's outside of the major economy. I don't think it should be.
I don't think it is. I mean, from what I understand in terms of like studies of the informal economy, and I'm using bunny ears, like I don't think it's taxable. That's the whole way that it's measured,
I don't know the details of it, but it's also due to the way Alaskan tribes are organized because they're recognized as corporations. And so using those terms like trade do have legal ramifications that may open it up to like a valuation system that will then have to be reported to the IRS if it supplements a huge part of their income, or if it's a way that they provide for their basic needs. And so that's why it is really important in our resistance work to not only understand the structures and the language and the policies, but to also work with one another to like navigate around those things. And a part of it goes back to your question about what does a free trade agreement look like when it's entered into between sovereign nations, and even within like what that economy and the language behind that looks like within a nation.
There's two more questions off Twitter. Does anyone else here have a question? I think if you do have a comment or question, it would have been better. I'm getting stuff on Twitter saying that online folks had a really hard time hearing you. Okay, if not, we're going to take the two questions on Twitter and then probably wrap things up. So one of the questions goes to Roberto. I think you can field this. Have you considered structures like housing cooperatives or community land trusts to take property into common ownership? Kind of a great question to field to you. And then the other question I think is more for Marley and Andrew. So Claire Burrell asked, how can myself and other African-American activists reclaim space or land with the knowledge that it is stolen from indigenous folks? What does solidarity look like in reclamation? So maybe Roberto, do you want to take the question around housing co-ops and land trusts first?
Yeah, definitely. We are not only thinking, we've been forced into it. The building where we had been for 15 years was attempted. There was an attempt, a gentrification attempt, and the buyer had already been in escrow, and we interrupted that purchase by confronting the buyer, the new buyer, and letting them know that we were, as a community, we were not going to allow him to build there. So he gave us a 10-day opportunity to come up with a bona fide offer, and he said, and he honored it, that he would back off. We were able to come up with the money, and he backed off. So we ended up with a huge mortgage. But it's been an experience. We have been negotiating with Caltrans around the houses behind the Eastside Cafe. We want to get them into a land trust. So we want to develop a land trust to hold all these buildings, and to also, the first thing we did was develop a garden on the principles of food sovereignty. And And then so we're looking at other possibilities of developing housing cooperatives because the state owns, purchased through eminent domain, 500 houses to build the 710 freeway, and the people defeated the freeway. So now it's surplus property. They have to sell it, but they have to sell it according to a law that states that they have to offer the people the houses at the prices that they bought it for in 1968, which makes it possible then for a lot of folks to come together and help each other out and develop the, especially with the multifamily units, develop co-ops and collectives to purchase the properties. So we're looking into all that. All of that is relatively new to us. We're learning fast, but we've always been for this. But it's kind of like the way that autonomy and sovereignty and a solidarity economy develops is by your current and specific conditions, your situation. So that's been our situation, and we've been moving in that direction.
Okay, so as regarding the question of how can members of the Black community, I guess, reclaim land that's with the knowledge that it's stolen, it goes back to, I guess, in the short term, if you do have space, allow indigenous organizers into that space. So let it become a safe space for radical indigenous people to organize. It's good to recognize that. I think when in the panel before, actually, Napoleon, he came here and the first thing he said was, I'd like to recognize whose land I'm on. I think that's a really good way of paying respect and almost homage, but also for me, a lot of this discussion was focused on economic issues. The decolonization, as Nick described it earlier, is that it's not just a project for indigenous people, it's also a project for, I guess, settlers as well. They have to help us reclaim our land. So my advice to any organized communities who are organizing in the US is like, hold that space until we dismantle like settler colonialism. And then once the US falls apart and we kind of take control over it, then we'll decide exactly what to do with that land, how we are going to distribute it. And then it becomes a question of how do we pull, this post-revolutionary project? How do we pull other people into this? And we've had discussions about what a Navajo post-revolutionary, collapse of the US government would look like. And that required a move away towards like this Navajo ethno state. It'd be more of like this understanding of relationships, maybe even creating new clan systems, and that kind of becoming a form of citizenship. This is like way in the future thinking. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. But for the time being, like, recognize that it is stolen land and do whatever you can to organize with indigenous people who are organizing in that proximity. I would like to see like Black Lives Matter organizing with indigenous people, working to dismantle settler colonialism and help indigenous people reclaim land. And then once beyond that, we'll figure it out together as to what will be done with space.
Yeah, so we can go over time because this is the last panel. So let's keep going. The thing you can do is you can buy us food, take us out to dinner. That's the way assuaging your settler guilt. Then you get a clan. We'll get you into the tribe. We'll give you honorary red or citizenship. No, I was just one of the things I think that we can start doing is again, like thinking about economic and political integration between our nations. Imagine if all of the nations in the Southwest alone, the independent indigenous nations, got together and integrated into one political unit. We could totally fuck up New Mexico and Arizona politics. We could play the states against each other. And this is a power that we have once we unite and once we come together. And that's where I think the solidarity is. I think we also ought to think about internationalism in going to international forums and putting representatives there. We all specialize in federal Indian law within our Department of Justice, within our lawyers, our higher tribal lawyers, but we don't specialize in international law or human rights law. These are the areas, these are the places, sites of struggle within the legal terrain that we haven't even started to address. So we can go to the except for Janine. But I mean, I'm talking about a government. I'm talking about the formal politics. So like we could go to the OAS, we can go to the UN, which a number of people go to, but our tribal governments don't put enough effort into these areas. We can go to Latin American countries. We can create bilateral deals between them. I mean, we can start to really think, broaden our imagination of what's possible beyond state compacts for casinos, which is all that we're doing right now. And so that's something that we need to start thinking about, us in the future, because the current political leadership's not going to. So once we take power, which is not going to be when the United States ends, but much sooner, then we'll start to do this. So Yvonne, sorry. Closing thoughts?
That's
it for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't have any closing thoughts other than this. Thank you for joining, both in person and also online. We're gonna.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roberto.
Thank
Did you have
very
any closing thoughts, Roberto?
No, I just want to thank everybody. I'm really inspired. Encouraged to think bigger, and to pay attention to some of that intuition of going bigger, and understanding that there's a lot of people throughout that are thinking the same thing, the same way we are. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And just a reminder that this is going to be saved. There's a recording saved on our website, solidarityresearch.org. So you can access it there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.